One day you'll stop waiting." The words were barely louder than a whisper. Lady Charlotte Ravenshire stood beneath the old oak tree overlooking the western lake, watching the evening sun disappear behind the hills. Beside her, her husband continued reading another stack of estate reports. Duke Adrian Ravenshire didn't even lift his eyes. What was that? Charlotte smiled softly. Nothing. She had learned that repeating herself rarely changed anything. He nodded absently. Good. Then returned to the papers. She watched him for another few seconds, then quietly folded the unfinished letter she'd been writing. She slipped it inside her journal. Neither of them realized that years later, that forgotten letter would become the one thing Adrian wished he had read before it was too late. When Adrian married Charlotte, everyone believed they would become the kingdom's happiest couple. Not because it was a love match. It wasn't. It was an arrangement between two ancient noble families. But they suited one another beautifully. Charlotte possessed kindness where Adrian possessed discipline. She brought warmth into every room. He brought stability. Even the Queen privately remarked, "Some marriages begin with love. Others grow into it." Charlotte believed theirs would. Adrian believed something very different. His father had died only months before the wedding. The duchy carried enormous debts, border disputes, field harvests. Hundreds of families depended upon him. Marriage became another responsibility. Nothing more. He respected Charlotte, protected her, provided generously. In his mind, that made him a good husband. Charlotte never asked for grand romance. She wanted conversation, shared meals, walks through the gardens, tiny moments, the ordinary pieces that quietly became extraordinary over time. During the first winter, she knocked gently on his study door. "I made your favorite soup." He smiled politely without looking up. "Leave it there. It will get cold. So will these contracts." She laughed softly. "I suppose paperwork is less forgiving than soup." He nodded. "Exactly." She waited. Perhaps he would invite her inside. Perhaps he would ask her to stay. He never did. The soup became cold. The conversation never began. Months turned into a year. Charlotte continued trying. Every attempt looked different. The result never changed. She invited him horseback riding. He had meetings. She suggested attending the village harvest festival. He had inspections. She prepared anniversary dinners. He had council sessions. He always apologized. Always sincerely. Never changed. Mrs. Langley, the elderly housekeeper, quietly noticed everything. One afternoon, she found Charlotte arranging flowers alone in the breakfast room. "You should tell him." Charlotte smiled. "I already have." "No." Mrs. Langley corrected gently. "You've told him your words." She placed another flower into the vase. "You haven't shown him your silence." Charlotte frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "One day you will." Charlotte thought about those words often. Instead of waiting outside Adrian's study, she slowly built another routine. She reopened abandoned music classrooms throughout the duchy, organized reading circles for village children, started apprenticeship programs for widows learning bookkeeping, created traveling libraries for isolated farming communities. The projects expanded naturally, not because she chased recognition, because people genuinely needed them. Soon, children waited eagerly for Lady Charlotte days. Teachers traveled long distances requesting advice. Villages competed to host her educational festivals. The newspapers praised the Duchess. Adrian occasionally noticed the articles. He smiled proudly. "My wife keeps busy." That became his favorite sentence. He never asked what kept her busy. One spring morning, the king's secretary arrived unexpectedly. Charlotte greeted him personally. Adrian remained inside his study discussing grain exports. The secretary delivered several sealed documents. Charlotte quietly signed them, thanked him, escorted him to the carriage. When Adrian finally emerged, the secretary had already gone. Who was visiting? The palace. Oh, he poured himself tea. Anything important? A little. He nodded. Good. The conversation ended. Mrs. Langley watched from the doorway. She slowly closed her eyes. That evening she spoke privately to Adrian. "Your Grace." "Yes." "The palace secretary visited today." "I know. Did you ask why?" He looked puzzled. "No. Should I have?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Perhaps." He smiled confidently. "If Charlotte needed me to know something, she would tell me." Mrs. Langley quietly answered. She tried. The second year arrived. Something subtle changed. Not outside. Inside Charlotte. She no longer waited beside windows for his carriage. She no longer counted how many evenings he worked late. She stopped asking whether he'd join her walks. Stopped setting 2 teacups in the garden. Stopped saving the last slice of pie. Tiny things. Almost invisible. Adrian appreciated the peace. He mistook surrender for contentment. One rainy afternoon, Charlotte sat inside the conservatory writing. Mrs. Langley approached. Another letter? Charlotte smiled. I never send them. Why write them? She looked toward the rain. Because the person I wish would read them never has time. She folded the page carefully, placed it inside the same leather journal, alongside dozens of others. Weeks later, the annual summer ball filled Ravensshire Manor with nobles from across the kingdom. Music echoed through enormous halls. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors. Every influential family attended. An elderly countess approached Adrian during dinner. You're fortunate. He smiled. I've heard. No. She laughed warmly. I mean your wife. She transformed our eastern villages. Adrian nodded politely. She enjoys charitable work. The countess looked confused. My dear Duke. She isn't discussing charity. She advises the Royal Education Council. Adrian blinked. The what? The Royal Education Council. She attends every month. You didn't know? Silence. Charlotte gracefully interrupted. The Countess gives me far too much credit. She redirected the conversation elsewhere, saving Adrian from embarrassment. Once again, later that night, he found her alone on the western balcony. You never mentioned the council. She looked surprised. I assumed you knew. How would I know? She smiled sadly. I thought perhaps. She stopped herself. Never mind. What? She shook her head. It doesn't matter. He sighed. Charlotte. She looked directly into his eyes. For 2 years, I've been hoping you would ask me about my life. Silence. You never did. He wanted to answer, to explain, to defend himself. Instead, someone called him back inside for another political discussion. Excuse me, he said automatically. This won't take long. She smiled. Of course. He hurried away. Charlotte remained on the balcony alone, watching fireworks bloom across the summer sky. That night, she wrote one final letter. Not to send, simply to finish something inside herself. My dear Adrian, today I realized something beautiful and something heartbreaking at exactly the same moment. The beautiful part is that life has continued. Children laugh. Gardens bloom. Music still sounds wonderful. The heartbreaking part is that I finally noticed I no longer look for your footsteps before smiling. She paused. Tears fell silently onto the page. She continued writing. I used to believe love disappeared in dramatic moments. It doesn't. It fades quietly. One postponed dinner. One unanswered question. One forgotten conversation. Until one ordinary morning. You wake up and discover you've stopped waiting. She folded the letter, placed it inside the leather journal, closed it gently, then whispered the same words Mrs. Langley had once spoken. One day you'll stop waiting. This time, she realized that day had finally arrived. The following weeks surprised everyone. Charlotte looked happier than ever. She laughed easily, accepted invitations, traveled frequently between villages, started planning new schools, posted concerts. The entire duchy seemed energized by her enthusiasm. Everyone noticed, except Adrian. He simply believed she had become accustomed to his schedule. One autumn afternoon, Adrian returned unexpectedly early from the capital. The manor felt strangely different. Peaceful. Almost. Lighter. He walked into the drawing room. Servants carefully packed several wooden crates filled with books, paintings, music scores, botanical journals, Charlotte's belongings. He frowned. What is all this? Mrs. Langley stopped working. She accepted. Accepted what? The elderly housekeeper looked genuinely surprised. The royal appointment. Adrian stared blankly. What appointment? Mrs. Langley's expression slowly changed. You truly don't know? Before he could answer, his eyes landed on the leather journal resting alone atop the final unopened crate. A folded letter peeked halfway from between its pages, written across the front, in Charlotte's unmistakable handwriting. For the day I stopped waiting. The leather journal rested alone atop the final crate. A single folded letter peeked from between its pages. Across the front, written in Charlotte's elegant handwriting, were 7 simple words. For the day I stopped waiting. Adrian reached toward it, then stopped. His hand hovered above the page. Mrs. Langley quietly watched from the doorway. You shouldn't. He looked up. Why? Because that letter wasn't written for the man you were. She paused. It was written for the man who would finally notice it. Silence filled the drawing room. Finally, Adrian unfolded the paper. My dear Adrian, if you're reading this, then one of two things has happened. Either you've finally become curious about my life, or I've finally stopped arranging it around yours. His chest tightened. I hope it's the first, but I fear it will be the second. He continued reading. Do you remember the first week after our wedding? You asked whether I liked the sunrise from the western hill. We watched it together. You said we should make it our tradition. We never went back. Not because you forgot the hill, because life kept convincing you there would always be another morning. A tear landed on the page. Adrian blinked. He hadn't cried since his father's funeral. I've spent 2 years learning something surprising. Loneliness isn't caused by empty rooms. It's caused by full rooms where the one person you wish would notice you never looks up. He lowered the letter. Unable to continue, Mrs. Langley quietly left, giving him privacy, for the first time in years. The manor felt unbearably silent. That evening Adrian wandered through the house. Not with purpose, simply looking, really looking. The music room. A violin rested beside the window. Dust barely covered it. How often? He asked the maid. She practices every Wednesday. I've never heard it. The maid smiled sadly. You were always meeting with the ministers. The library. Hundreds of books carried tiny handwritten notes tucked between pages. Ideas. Poems. Garden sketches. Educational plans. Charlotte's handwriting appeared everywhere. He had lived beside an extraordinary mind, without ever opening the pages. Then, he walked to the conservatory. Night had already fallen. Moonlight poured through the glass roof. Flowers glowed softly beneath hanging lanterns. He found a gardener still working. The elderly man recognized him immediately. Your Grace. How long has Her Grace been building this? The gardener laughed warmly. Building. He looked around proudly. She dreamed of this before she became your wife. Adrian frowned. She never told me. The gardener looked genuinely confused. She spoke about little else. Another sentence. Another quiet knife. The following morning Adrian canceled every council meeting. His secretary looked horrified. The royal treasury? Cancelled. The trade negotiations? They'll survive. The Duke of Norchester? He can wait. The secretary stared. You've never postponed state business. Adrian quietly answered. I've postponed my marriage for 2 years. He traveled across the duchy alone. No escort. No ceremony. He wanted to see what Charlotte had built. The first village welcomed him politely. Children played outside a beautiful stone library. Above the entrance hung a carved wooden sign. Charlotte House of Learning. A teacher approached. You're Her Grace's husband. Yes. You must be very proud. Adrian forced a smile. I am. She always speaks kindly about you. His heart sank. She does. The teacher nodded. She says you're carrying enormous responsibilities. She never lets anyone think poorly of you. The second village held a music festival. Young girls played violins beneath flowering trees. Every instrument carried a small silver plaque, gifted by Duchess Charlotte Ravensshire. The third village had transformed an abandoned mill into a reading hall. Old farmers gathered there every evening, learning to read for the first time. One elderly man proudly showed Adrian his handwriting. She told me it was never too late. Everywhere Adrian traveled, he found Charlotte. Not physically. In the lives she had changed. After 6 weeks, he finally accepted what terrified him most. The kingdom knew his wife better than he did. One rainy afternoon, the king's secretary arrived again, this time looking for Adrian. His Majesty requests your presence. At once. Yes. The royal palace felt strangely familiar. Charlotte had spent countless days here. He suddenly wondered. Had she walked these same corridors hoping he might one day ask how her afternoon had gone? The queen received him privately. She poured tea herself. Neither spoke immediately. Finally she asked, You've read the letter. He looked surprised. You knew? Charlotte left a sealed copy in the royal archives. She said. The queen smiled sadly. If my husband ever starts looking for me, he'll probably begin with paperwork. Despite everything, Adrian laughed softly. That sounds like her. The queen nodded. She knows you well. Another pause. Do you know her? He lowered his eyes. I thought I did. No. She corrected gently. You knew the woman who waited. The woman she became. She had to become without you. Those words remained with him. Where is she? He finally asked. The queen looked toward the palace gardens. She accepted a permanent appointment. At the Royal Academy. She oversees educational programs throughout the kingdom now. Can I see her? The queen smiled. That depends. On what? Whether you're searching for forgiveness. We're finally searching for your wife. 2 days later, Adrian traveled to the academy. The old monastery overlooking the river had become the most respected educational center in the kingdom. Children filled the courtyards. Artists painted beneath flowering trees. Teachers debated philosophy beneath ancient archways. Music echoed from every hallway. Life existed everywhere. Then he saw her. Charlotte stood surrounded by students. She wore a simple blue gown. No jewels. No ceremony. Yet somehow, she looked more radiant than he had ever remembered. Not because she had changed. Because sadness no longer lived behind her smile. She noticed him. Surprise crossed her face. Then calm. Adrian. Charlotte. Silence. Gentle. Neither hostile nor warm. Simply honest. I read your letter. She nodded. I thought perhaps one day you might. I should have read it years ago. You couldn't. He frowned. Why? Because you weren't listening yet. They walked slowly through the academy gardens. Students greeted Charlotte constantly. Every few moments someone stopped to thank her. She remembered every name, every dream, every family. Adrian watched quietly, finally understanding why children ran toward her instead of away from titles. I kept waiting. He admitted. For what? For the right moment. She smiled sadly. Life rarely announces those. I thought providing was enough. I know. I thought respecting you was love. I know. I was wrong. Yes. There was no cruelty in her answers. Only truth. I don't expect you to come home. He whispered. I don't deserve that. She looked toward the river. You're right. The honesty hurt. Yet somehow, it also felt deserved. But, she continued, I'm glad you finally read the letter. He looked at her hopefully. Why? Because it means the man I wrote it for finally exists. Months passed. Adrian did not ask Charlotte to abandon the academy. Instead, he began visiting. Not every day, not to persuade her. Simply to know her. Really know her. He attended lectures. Helped build libraries. Read stories to children. Listened. Asked questions. Remembered answers. Small things. The things Charlotte had always wanted. One spring morning they returned to the Western Hill, where they had watched the sun rise during their first week of marriage. Wildflowers covered the hillside. The valley shimmered beneath golden morning light. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Adrian smiled. I remembered. Charlotte looked around. The sunrise. Yes. She nodded softly. So did I. He reached into his coat, removing the old folded letter, carefully preserved, worn from countless readings. I've read this every week. She smiled gently. I hoped you wouldn't stop after the first time. He looked toward the horizon. You once wrote that love fades through ordinary moments. I did. I think it returns the same way. Charlotte looked at him. How? One conversation. One remembered promise. One sunrise. One question. One answer. One ordinary day at a time. She slipped her hand into his. Not because 2 years of loneliness had disappeared. Not because a letter could erase silence. But because the man beside her was finally doing what she had once prayed he would. He was no longer searching for the woman he had ignored. He was learning, day by day, how to truly see her. And sometimes, the greatest love stories didn't begin with perfect romance. They began the moment someone finally looked up from everything else and chose never to look away again.